This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. Major disruptions at airports, banks and telecommunications companies from Europe to the US. And here in Asia, Japan, Hong Kong, South Korea among those affected by a global cyber outage. Well, China's third plenum disappoints investors hoping for stronger economic stimulus measures, with some pointing out the lack of specific measures on reform. And U.S. Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump flaunts his personal ties with North Korean leader Kim Jong Un, signaling a desire to restart talks with Pyongyang. And a growing number of Hong Kong-listed companies are reportedly looking to delist as depressed share prices and China's economic downturn weigh. Ahead on East Asia Tonight, we revisit the challenges faced by educators in South Korea 1 year after a first-grade teacher took her life due to harassment by students' parents. Large-scale cyber outages have hit countries and companies across the world, affecting flights, banking, and media operations. Now, the disruption, which is linked to Microsoft's Windows software, appears to be due to an issue with cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike. And for more, CNA's Lim Yun-suk, she joins us now from Seoul. Yun-suk, we are hearing that South Korea is among the countries affected by the disruption. Can you tell us more about that? Just how badly affected is it?
Well, yes. Well, we don't have too much detail right now, but the failure of Microsoft's cloud service has had some impact here in South Korea. Now, the booking or issuing air tickets by some of the low-cost carriers were disrupted late this afternoon. Also, we are hearing that some of the domestic online game servers were not working, but authorities here are saying that no cases of damage have been reported in any of the major companies and the banking systems here too, which apparently use their own servers or the domestic clouds. Now, elsewhere in Asia, like in Hong Kong, we're hearing that there is a similar situation with the online systems down. There at the Hong Kong International Airport, apparently there have been long queues reported as the check-ins had to be done manually. Also in Japan, we are hearing that some of the Microsoft systems were down and that some of the they were not able to upload any of the Microsoft's programs. And apparently authorities elsewhere are also reporting similar situations. But, in places like in Beijing, we're hearing that flights have not been affected. And also Taiwan, two of the major airlines there have said that systems were operating normal, although some of the airlines there too have had to check in their people and manually due to the computer problems.
Thanks very much for that report, Lim Yun-suk, speaking to us from Seoul. And we'll also have expert analysis from an IT professor a little later in the bulletin. Meantime, shares of the Texas-based computer security company CrowdStrike linked to the outage slumping as much as 14% in early hours of trading. Shares of Microsoft, too, down nearly 2%. The company declared its Azure and Microsoft 365 issues resolved at 1 p.m., but that appeared to only be true in the U.S. You can, of course, get live updates via cna.asia. Chinese officials have acknowledged that the list of economic goals that came out of the third plenum contain many complex contradictions, pointing to a bumpy road ahead for policy implementation. And China's consumer and business sentiment are near record lows domestically. But there are few signs that the top leadership is preparing major steps to boost demand or arrest the property slump.
推进中国式现代化面临许多复杂矛盾和问题，必须克服种种困难和阻力，需要通过进一步全面深化改革，推动生产关系和生产力、上层建筑和经济基础、国家治理和社会发展。
Following the 4-day closed-door meetings, officials made a raft of seemingly contradictory pledges, from modernizing the industrial complex while also expanding domestic demand to stimulating growth and simultaneously curbing debt risks. The initial summary of the meeting did not give details on how Beijing plans to resolve the tensions between policy goals, such as how to get consumers to spend more while resources flow primarily to producers and infrastructure. Well, China is expected to publish a document with more detailed policy plans in the coming days. And for more, Olivia Seong, she joins us now live from Beijing. Ollie, this week we've been talking to you as well as some analysts about how this plenum isn't quite typically the platform to address short-term challenges like employment, like domestic consumption, but there is mounting pressure to address people's day-to-day concerns. So, Olivia, was this also talked about or mentioned today?
I'll tell you, we do know that there have been calls from some quarters for the government to take stronger action and to implement more stimulus measures, given the weaker than expected economic data that was released in the second quarter that we saw earlier this week. There did seem to be some acknowledgement of that today, with pledges of robust reform to ensure, quote, micro entities can feel the benefits. The official today at the news conference gave a rather clear snapshot of the challenges that we have seen, mentioning a lack of domestic demand, difficulties that businesses face in operations, financial difficulties of some local governments. And specifically, we do know that what has been a major drag on the property sector has been, on the economy, has been China's property sector, making up about 30% of the country's GDP. Officials noting that it does have a systemic impact on many sectors. Even though mitigating measures have been put in place, this has seen limited effects. But this is how the official addressed it.
当前房地产市场供求关系发生重大变化，市场呢处在调整的过程。我们要坚持稳中求进、先立后破，用改革的办法解决前进中的问题，加快新旧发展动能转换，为高质量发展提供多元而强劲的动力支撑。
But officials do seem to be of the view that this is necessary pain that perhaps has to take place as the economy undergoes some sort of structural transition. And we saw the official talk about speeding up the development of a new model of real estate development, eliminating the old model of, quote, high debt, high turnover and high leverage. At the same time, also stressing the need to speed up development of emerging industries, to cultivate new engines for economic development, and needing, especially here, to expand domestic demand in the face of international challenges. And we do know that domestic demand has continued to be a persistent problem that authorities can't seem to get a hand on. Atali.
Olivia, what we also know is that China seems to be facing mounting uncertainties on the external front. Any signals as to how China intends to address those issues?
Well, Tenny, when we think of external challenges, we think of China's growing tensions with the U.S. There was no specific mention of the U.S., but officials did point to growing uncertainties when asked a question about it, as we have also seen not just the U.S., but the European Union and more countries introduce tariffs on Chinese goods. Also, that talk about the U.S. considering tightening those controls on chip exports to China. And this has led China to increasingly talk, including in this communique, about becoming more self-reliant. And some observers have thus questioned whether or not that would mean that China, despite its pledges of opening up, would become more inward-looking. But officials seem to try to allay those concerns, saying it was confident that the country would be able to push forward with reform. Have a listen.
坚持对外开放是我们的基本国策，改革开放相辅相成。 以开放促改革促发展，是我们改革发展的成功实践。当前世界100年未有之大变局正在加速演进，外部不确定性确实在增加，但不会影响中国继续深化改革、扩大开放的坚定的决心和信心。
Thanks, Olivia, but do stick around because we're going to need your insights as well as a guest, which will come on board to unpack all of this a little after the break. And coming up on East Asia tonight, as I've mentioned, we do have that expert joining us right after the break as we delve into the market implications of what we've heard so far from China's third plenum. And the number of tourists to Japan surged to a record high last month as a weak yen makes the country a bargain. Well, glad to have your company on East Asia tonight. Circling back to our earlier story on China's third plenum, we take a look next at what the statements mean for its economy. And we have our senior correspondent in Beijing, Olivia Xiong, joining us once again. And also joining us this evening is Chi Wang, Chief Investment Officer, Wealth Management at UOB Kay Hian. Well, thanks very much for joining us this evening. Mr. Wang, we know that there will be more to come in the coming days in terms of what we can expect, a full decision of the document. But some economists, they are actually saying that they are disappointed that the statements have stuck rather largely to the existing playbook. And I'm just wondering, what's your take on this?
Yes, well, there are reasons to be disappointed because prior to this, there have been a lot of talks about whether there'll be another stimulus or China will print money or have a higher fiscal spending, that type of things. Of course, this is not the occasion where China lays out specific policy. Like you said, we look forward to those specific policies in the coming days. And one additional disappointment, you also talked about this earlier, two additional disappointment come from the fact that there was no addressing of so-called the population crisis in China. I thought this might be the bigger problem than real estate longer term. And then there's very little addressing of the so-called external pressure or the U.S.-China relations. And with Trump now potentially becoming the president, I think there will be more economic pressure on China. And we can talk more about that if you like.
Mr. Wang, you mentioned that there was some disappointments, but at the same time, there was also an unusual mention about having to be able to meet and press forward with meeting goals set for this year. There is, belief that a lot of this talk that we're seeing in the communique is more rhetoric, more political than economic. How far would you say what you have seen so far will help China achieve its economic goal of growth of around 5% for this year?
Well, one thing, maybe just change the topic a little bit, that one thing I think they did right was on reforms, because they knew that the market expects this third plenum to be a reform occasion, because historically the third plenum is earmarked for talk about Chinese reform. So you could say that prior to this happening, the government or the party already thinking that, okay, what can we put in our press release? What can we talk about in order to so-called please the market? So that's a good thing that they focus on the reform as expected. It's just that, like you said, we don't see any specific policies. There's a lot of word salads that even I don't understand as a Chinese from the press release. But as you can see, they have tried being very hard to put the word reform into it. And like you said, I'm with you that I'm also somewhat skeptical of how you rhyme reform with growth, right? The difference about reform this time versus previous cycles is that China did not have a real estate problem before. China did not have consumption problem before, did not have low confidence before, or did not have a Trump factor. But now, clearly, at the current juncture, China need to deal with all the other challenges, not just economic challenges, external pressure I talk about. So could reform alone solve all these problems? We don't know. So that's another thing that the market is asking questions about and want to know more about in the coming days.
So what then, Mr. Wang, do you think it's going to take to convince these investors, before they're making a decision to invest more in China?
Yeah, that's also a very tricky question. But before I talk about it, I do want to mention one fact, which is positive because the delayed third plenum finally happened. Let's not forget, this thing has been overhand on the market for a long time. In order for the government, the party to function properly, you need to have these plenum to happen one after another. So if you don't have the third plenum, you're not going to have the fourth, and you can up to having the seventh, right? So it's good that this happened. And it's good that we removed overhand and shows you that China's, you have stability at the top, political stability at the top, which is good, whether and how fast the economy grows or not. You want China to have a stable, leadership, which is good. That's the good news. Now, the not so good news, just back to your question, yeah, it's complicated. The analogy I'll make is this. As an Asian parent, you can probably appreciate my analogy, which is think about the economy or the market as a child. The government is the father, and the investors are the mother. We investors are very simple. The mother is very simple. We just want to make money. And the mother just wants the child to have good grades and achieve academically. But the father now has many other thoughts. The government. From the press release, you can see they want the economy to serve many different purposes. So they want the child to not only do well in school, but take on a lot of extracurricular activities, to make a lot of friends, to learn piano, to play sports, to learn martial arts, and maybe to fight this school bully called Trump, right? So you can see in that situation, this is exactly what's happening to Chinese economy or the markets right now. It's under stress because there are many different goals. There are a lot of ambitious mandates imposed on the economy today versus us investors. We just want growth and we just want to make money. Maybe we're just too simplistic, but China clearly is embarked on a more sophisticated path. And that may differ from what investors want. That's what we've been telling clients, that we need to be prepared. I won't say there's necessarily a conflict of interest, but there might be some misalignment of interest in that sense. So growth may be no longer the top priority. And other things like security and international relations. And also under security, there's so many security agendas: energy security, food security, cyber security, social security, and also economic security. So how do you reconcile all these security agenda? I don't have the answer. And that's why the market is also frustrated about it.
Mr. Wang, I want to go back to what you mentioned, Mr. Wang, about the Trump factor here. And you mentioned also growth. Because Mr. Trump, he has talked about proposed tariffs of 60% on Chinese imports, also now talking about 100 to 200% tariffs on Chinese EVs. What sort of impact do you think that's going to have on China's growth? And do you think from this third plenum, what you've seen so far, that China is hedging against another term that Mr. Trump may have in the White House?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. So the assumption that Trump will become president, the assumption also that Trump will continue to crank up the tariffs and economic pressure on China. So just to remind you, this third plenum is both a political as well as economic event, probably more political. So let me also kind of put this context from the geopolitical angle as well as the economic angle. I'm not an expert on geopolitics, but from what Trump has said so far, seems that there may be less geopolitical pressure on China. And remember what you said about Taiwan. He wants Taiwan to pay for the defense. He even wants TSMC to pay for the protection, that type of things, right? So political pressure might be lower, but like you said, economic pressure may be significantly higher. Both Trump and Biden are fans of tariffs. And remember, whether the 60% tariff or not, the existing tariffs on over $400 billion of goods are still around from the Trump era. And then Biden added another $18 billion of goods under tariffs, but Biden is more of a tech war guy. He's not a trade war guy, right? So my assessment is that the so-called the relationship with going from back to the traditional trade war between the U.S. and China, not the high-tech war. The high-tech war, in hindsight, didn't really have that much negative impact on China. It's a very small fraction of the economy. And you can almost say high-tech, by definition, don't really make that much money. You need to invest in a lot. It's a long payoff. It's not economical. But if Trump, I think, highly likely will return to the traditional, right, trade war about these 60%, whatever. And then when he does it, he often does it with all goods. He doesn't care whether it's high tech or low tech. So that will mean a more economic pressure on China. And also connecting this to what's happening to China today, we are mainly relying on exports to grow. Second quarter consumption is extremely weak, and exports have been picking up the slack. So having this trade relations with the U.S. will be critical.
Well,
for
many
future
thanks
economic
for your assessment. That was a great discussion here in East Asia tonight. Chi Wang from UOB Kay Hian, and as always, Olivia Seong in Beijing.
Thank you.
Look now at how stock markets in Greater China are reacting to those public statements from the third plenum. Mainland markets closed higher amid hopes that specific measures will be spelt out in a final document next week. Hong Kong's Hang Seng, however, tumbled 2%. Investors felt let down by the lack of new policy support for the struggling property sector. And the decline also means that Hong Kong shares posted the biggest weekly loss in almost 2 months. Now, negotiations might resume for Samsung Electronics and the workers' biggest union. Both sides are planning to meet today to set a firm negotiation schedule. The union has been on an indefinite strike over pay and benefits. Its 30,000 members make up almost a quarter of the firm's workforce. Analysts say that a long drawn-out strike by key personnel will add to challenges faced by Samsung as it competes internationally in semiconductors. Well, the world's biggest memory chip maker says that the strike has not disrupted chip production. Samsung Electronics shares closing nearly 3% lower, steeper than the fall in Korean benchmark Kospi. Japan welcomed a record number of visitors in June. A weak yen is fueling a tourism boom that's becoming a key driver for the economy. Well, the number of foreign visitors rose further from May to reach 3.14 million last month. For the January to June period, the number hit nearly 18 million, also a record high for the first half. And that puts it on track to smash an annual peak of 31.9 million posted in 2019, before COVID-19 halted global travel. Now, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida said today spending by visitors is estimated to reach $50 billion this year. Tourism is expected to become Japan's second biggest export sector for 2024, behind automobiles. Well, the yen's plunge to a 38-year low against the dollar has made Japan a bargain for overseas travelers. Of the 23 markets tracked by the Japan National Tourism Organization, travelers from 18 regions set new records for June arrivals. While traveler spending has been a boon for the economy, the masses at visitor hotspots has rankled some locals. Crowded trails and increased littering on Japan's sacred Mount Fuji this month prompted officials to impose admission fees and hiker limits for the first time. Now, a growing number of Hong Kong-listed companies are reportedly looking to delist as depressed share prices and China's economic downturn weigh. And as such, more firms are also planning to go private to tackle rising costs and boost their businesses. So far this year, delistings have outnumbered IPOs. And as of end June, at least 14 Hong Kong-listed firms have announced moves to delist. Now, Dealogic data shows that one such firm has completed the process in a deal worth $8.5 billion, and that far exceeds the $1.7 billion raised by 30 companies which went public during the same period. Now, such a trend was reportedly last seen in the first half of 2020 during the pandemic. Well, deal advisors note that more companies are receiving inquiries from bankers and investors on going private. The value for 8 companies turning private in the first half of the year has reached $3.8 billion, and that accounts for nearly 45% of the total delisting value in the same period last year. Well, time now to go for a short break, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, a follow-up on South Korean teachers fearing their own students. We hear your thoughts and delve deeper into a troubling trend of teacher abuse. Large-scale cyber outages hit countries and companies across the world, affecting flights, banking and media operations. China's third plenum disappoints investors hoping for stronger economic stimulus measures, with some pointing out the lack of specific measures on reform. And U.S. Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump flaunts his personal ties with North Korean leader Kim Jong Un, signaling a desire to restart talks with Pyongyang. A little more than a week ago, we brought to you on East Asia Tonight a 2-part series on the challenges that school teachers in East Asia faced, including one on the situation in South Korea. Well, that coverage, including a related chat with our CNA senior correspondent Lim Yun-suk in Seoul, has taken on a life of its own, sparking numerous comments from viewers. And here's a look back at some of the excerpts from the story.
This video went viral last month. It shows a third-grade student slapping the vice principal when he tried to stop the boy from leaving school without permission. He did not try to defend himself, which education experts say is understandable.
교감 선생님은 뒷짐을 지고 뺨을 맞아요. 혹자는 이런 얘기합니다. 그 왜 그러지? 애를 손을 잡고 적극적으로 말리고 못하게 해야지 이런 얘기합니다. 현실을 모르는 얘기예요. 만일 그 아이의 손을 잡았다가 팔자국이 남으면 어떻게 될까요? 당연히 아동학대로 신고됩니다.
Kim Dong-seok, the director of Teachers' Rights at the Korean Federation of Teachers Association, says teachers in South Korea have suffered abuse by students and their parents for years. The issue came to light in July last year after a first-grade teacher at Soi Elementary in Seoul took her life in school. Her colleagues said she suffered harassment from parents. Her death sparked rallies calling for measures to safeguard teachers' rights. And authorities made key changes, including providing teachers with some protection from being sued for child abuse.
Following the story, we've had a slew of comments online. One viewer questioned the act of slapping a teacher, saying that he or she would get thrown out from the house for such disrespect. And this attracted more than 4,000 likes and some 50 replies. And another highlighted the issue of entitled parents and students driving teachers away from the profession. And one netizen also weighed in, suggesting that the child should be expelled. At least 1,000 thumbs up came in response. Now, there was an event yesterday to mark the anniversary of the death of elementary school teacher Lee Min-so, who took her own life last year after allegedly being harassed by students' parents. And our senior correspondent Lim Yun-suk joins us now to share more about it. Yun-suk, can you just tell us more about the memorial? I imagine it must have been very emotional.
Well, yes, it was. It did remind people here in South Korea of what happened 1 year ago. And there were tributes coming in from across the country here, those working in the education industry, but also others too, ordinary South Koreans, because this is the week where South Koreans are marking the first anniversary of the teacher's death. And in fact, the Korean Confederation of Teachers Association, which is one of the 2 major teachers unions in the country, had designated this week, starting Monday, as a period of remembrance. Now, at the memorial in Seoul, there were hundreds of teachers, education officials, and also families of that teacher who died, and also families of other teachers who have died in recent years. They also all attended this memorial service. Park Do-young, who's the cousin of that teacher who passed away last year, he gave a speech on behalf of the family members like him who lost their loved ones due to the abuse by parents against teachers. Now, let's first listen to what he had to say.
여기 계신 모든 분들에게 부탁드리겠습니다. 교육 공동체 안에서 비극을 막고자 자살 예방에 대한 철저한 지원과 유가족들에 대한 지원을 통해 이들의 마음을 조금 헤아려 주셨으면 감사하겠습니다. 제 지금 요청은 돌아가신 고인분의 엄마 아빠의 울음입니다.
You know, as you can see, he was very emotional, and I think it's very important to hear what he was saying because we forget about the families and loved ones who are left behind and how, you know, many of the family members have to deal with it, especially the children of the teachers, because here in Korea, most of the time, people just feel like they have to deal with that pain on their own, and many don't seek professional help. And so it's important for him to ask the South Korean government to give support and help to the family members here, too.
Yeah, which is something which, you know, I'd like you to elaborate on, Yoon-suk, because 1 year on, based on a survey, 8 out of 10 teachers in Seoul say that there's been not much change in the protection of teachers' rights. Even 5% said that, in fact, it got worse. So how exactly are the authorities responding, you know, to this?
Well, they have put measures in place after the death of that teacher, but it is true, and experts did say that, you know, it was going to take time for them to have any impact really on the teachers. Now, this is not an overnight solution to this, but at least experts were saying that the measures are there now, and teachers know that they are going to be able to get more protection from their schools and the South Korean government. But it's a shame that they haven't been able to feel this impact yet. And in fact, you know, the teachers' unions recently conducted another survey, and according to that survey of about 1,000 teachers in the capital Seoul, about 78% said that parents' attitudes had not changed, while about 79% said that they had experienced abuse by parents, just like that teacher who died last year. Now, at that memorial event yesterday, there was no mention of those survey, but the Education Minister Lee Ji-ho was there too, and he gave a short speech, and let's hear what, you know, he had to say in that speech.
선생님의 정당한 교육 활동을 보호하는 것이 곧 우리 아이들의 배움의 권리를 보호하는 것이기에 가는 길이 어렵더라도 우리는 끝까지 걸어갈 것입니다. 선생님 여러분, 한 뜻으로 함께 모인 오늘을 기억하겠습니다. 그리고 선생님께서 홀로 어려움과 마주하지 않도록 교육부도 함께 걸어가겠습니다.
And he also said that the voices of teachers desperately calling for help and restoration of teachers' rights last summer still remained very heavy in his heart and also the hearts of South Koreans. And so I think it does because it is an incident that many still here are talking about and have not been able to forget.
And that's clearly reflected in the story that we did, last week, which has reached 460,000 views on YouTube and also generated a lot of comments, as we've mentioned. And I thought we would just sort of pick up on that, run through some of the comments. And one viewer, right, interestingly commented that slapping a teacher, because in my times I'll be thrown out on the street by my own parents for such disrespect. Yoon-suk, do we then have any updates on the student who actually slapped that principal a month ago? I mean, was disciplinary action taken, or has this incident actually set a precedent for similar behavior among other students?
Well, it has. I mean, according to reports here, the student's mother apparently went back to the school after that incident where her child slapped the vice principal and voiced complaints against the school and even abused the son's school teacher. Now, education authorities at that northern province of Jeolla, where that incident took place, filed charges against the mother as a possible case of child abuse by neglect. Now, apparently the school had told the mother several times that the boy needed help, but she chose to ignore that advice, and the police says that measures have been taken against this mother. Now, according to the Child Abuse Punishment Act here in South Korea, there are various measures that the police can take against the abuser, and those measures range from 1 to 7, with 7 being the most severe, if it is deemed necessary to protect the abused child. Now, in this case, apparently the mother was imposed with number Number 5 Protection Act, which means that the mother will be receiving counseling and education at a child protection agency. Now, news reports also was saying that the student was temporarily suspended for about 10 days from school, but this is not the first time for the student to be expelled or to be, disciplinary action been taken against the student. Apparently, he also has problems in other schools because he had to change schools about 7 times in the recent years. And so it seems like, teachers there had been giving the mother advice, but she just didn't take it.
Wow, change schools 7 times. That does say something about the student. We're getting other online reaction where some people are saying, what kind of society will South Korea become if elementary students are allowed to act so inappropriately? And it's good to see that there have been some measures on a range of 1 to 7 that they've put in place. But how do you see these behavior, for instance, shaping societal norms and values in the long run if they go unchecked?
Well, I must say that this incident is not what you will see in normal schools. I mean, this is a special case, and that's why it caused a huge alarm here in South Korea, too, among South Koreans. And many were saying, surely this is not what's happening in our schools every day. And so it is a rare case. But then, teachers I spoke to did say that they were not surprised. And though it might not be to, that extreme of a student slapping the vice principal, there are lots of abuses against teachers by parents and students, too, who now think that they can get away with it and that their parents will still support them. But having said that, I'd like to point out that respect for teachers here in South Korea still do exist. In fact, there's a Teachers' Day, which falls on May 15th, and it's a day when parents and students all gather to show their appreciation to teachers. And so respect for teachers by South Koreans here still exist, and many still believe that should exist here in South Korea. So I do want to point out that this is a rare case here in Korea.
Well, good to know, Yoon-suk, that is a rare case. It's heartening to know that. But despite that, the number of newly hired teachers, though, this year has declined by over 50% compared to 2014. And on top of it, the average monthly salary is just, $1,900. So I'm wondering, how is teaching seen as a rewarding career in South Korea?
Well, no, not many people want to be a teacher here in South Korea these days. I mean, there was a time when Koreans, their dream was to become a teacher because they just felt that it was something that they wanted to do, but it was safe. And they had the respect. There used to be a saying here in Korea that people would not even walk in the shadows of a teacher, showing how much respect they had for the teachers. But, another reason for the decline in the teachers here in South Korea is not because of this abuse by the parents, but because of this low birth rate in South Korea. There are lots of South Korean schools, elementary schools, even here in the capital Seoul, that are closing because they just don't have enough students to be in that classroom. And that's why they're hiring less teachers. And so that's also, one of the reasons why you see less teachers being hired here in South Korea.
Well, thanks for pointing that out. I mean, low birth rates certainly contributing to less teachers as well. CNA's senior correspondent in Seoul, Lim Yoon-suk, always good speaking with you. In other news, former U.S. President Donald Trump has talked up his personal ties with North Korean leader Kim Jong Un after accepting the Republican Party's nomination to run in November this morning.
I got along very well. North Korea, Kim Jong Un, I got along very well with him. The press hated when I said that. How could you get along with him? Well, it's nice to get along with somebody who has a lot of nuclear weapons or otherwise, isn't it? See, in the old days, they say, that's a wonderful thing. Now they say, how can you possibly do that? But no, I got along with them, and we stopped the missile launches from North Korea. Now North Korea is acting up again, but when we get back, I get along with them. He'd like to see me back, too. I think he misses me, if you want to know the truth.
Mr. Trump also said he will bring stability to a world that was, quote, blowing up. South Korean media reports say these comments are a sign that the U.S. presidential hopeful is keen to resume talks with the North if he's elected. Mr. Trump first met the North Korean leader at a historic Singapore summit back in 2018. But talks fell through after a second no-deal summit in Hanoi 1 year later. The possible return of Donald Trump to the White House could have far-reaching impacts in Asia. In his first meeting with foreign media on Friday, Taiwan's Foreign Minister Lin Chiao-lung sought to allay concerns. Well, he described the island's relationship with the U.S. as rock solid, saying that both sides share the same position over what he called the China threat. CNA's Victoria Jen has more from Taipei.
It's the first meet and greet session with the foreign media for Lin Chiao-lung since the 60-year-old's appointment as the island's top diplomat in May. Despite the casual settings of tea and snacks, reporter questions were centered on the tense cross-strait relations and the possible return of another Trump administration in the U.S. The U.S. presidential candidate recently said Taiwan should pay the U.S. for its defense. When asked, Mr. Lin said Taiwan's military spending has nearly doubled in the past 8 years, under former President Tsai Ing-wen, with the U.S. as the primary source of arms.
好，所以这个数字可以呈现台湾是我们付我们该付的军费。那台湾的这个国防支出已经从不到2%，占我们的这个GDP 已经增加到2.5%，在短短的8年之间。那我预期也会再持续增加。
Mr. Lin held different positions in the government in the past, but critics said that he had little experience in foreign affairs. If Mr. Trump wins the election in November, the former Taichung city mayor and once transportation minister will have to assist President William Lai to navigate what could be a volatile 4 years ahead in the island's relations with the U.S. and growing diplomatic pressure from China. Mr. Lin said various timelines of possible Chinese attacks were being floated, calling them attempts to paralyze Taiwan.
台湾就是我们要做好各种就是说可能中共会犯台的因应的准备，但是我们要很团结。这个团结包括我们国内大家能够团结一起，也帮跟国际理念相近的国家能够团结在一起。好，那我们也期待习近平每一天早上醒来的时候，就算他有未来的时间表，他会说那 not today。
Mr. Lin said that if Taiwan is able to resist the pressure, he believes time is on the island's side. Victoria Jen, CNA, Taipei.
A time now for another short break, but coming up in East Asia tonight, major disruptions at airports, banks, and businesses across the world following a widespread IT outage. Well, we'll be speaking to an expert for more insight. A widespread IT outage has caused flight cancellations and delays at nearly all major airports around the world. In Asia, disruptions have been reported at airports in India, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia. Well, 5 Indian airlines say there are problems in their booking systems. Indigo, the country's largest carrier, says that check-ins and access to boarding passes have been impacted. Long queues snaked across the gates of Mumbai International Airport. A national airline, Air India, says its digital systems are temporarily down, causing flight delays. Now, Hong Kong International Airport has reverted to manual check-in procedures, but flight operations remain unaffected. Authorities have activated emergency response mechanisms and advised travelers to arrive at the airport earlier. Well, a similar situation in Singapore's Changi Airport, where staff are doing manual check-ins. Crowds have packed the arrival halls, and some passengers expressed confusion about the disruption. Well, the impact has also spread beyond airports. In the UK, for instance, hospitals, banks and train services saw their computers shut down. Australia's government has called an emergency meeting to cope with widespread IT crashes. Well, the cybersecurity company in question, CrowdStrike, says that it has identified a defect in a content update for Windows. It emphasizes that this is not a cyber attack, and it says a fix for the defect has been deployed. And for more analysis, we are joined by David Perry, Dean and Professor at the School of IT at Murdoch University, and he speaks to us from Perth, Australia. Well, thanks, Professor, for joining us this evening. So, tell us a little bit more about this incident. CrowdStrike has ruled out the possibility of a cyber attack. They said that it's a defect in one of its software updates, but this defect can actually disrupt airlines and banks?
Yes, absolutely. Well, of course, it's completely non-wanted, but what's happened is that the software that CrowdStrike have regularly updates effectively files around the threats that may be attacking people's computers, and also whether there's abnormal activity on computers. So that's what they're for. And these updates happen regularly. But unfortunately, the latest update, some of the data in that update interacted with the Windows operating system so that the Windows crashed and then effectively couldn't automatically reboot. And so it's having to be rebooted manually in the safe mode. So it's a major effect.
But you wouldn't say that this is a common occurrence, right?
It's extremely rare. I mean, this is probably the largest thing that we've seen in this type of event. Regularly, software is updated automatically very, very regularly all around the world. One of the things that's interesting about this one is because all of the software was updated at the same time. Usually things like Windows updates happen in a staged fashion, and companies often hold back some of the updates. But because this is seen as a relatively minor update, it all got pushed out at the same time. So it's affected the whole world at the same time.
Right, it's interesting you've said it's a minor update, but such a major disruption. Professor, how then help us understand why is it that some organizations, they're experiencing more severe impacts than others?
So it'll depend what sort of mix of operating systems. So this only really affects Windows 10 and 11, I believe. But it also, of course, they would have to be subscribing to CrowdStrike. And so a lot of companies would have, for example, banks and health authorities and things like that, would have a more secure system, which wasn't necessarily being updated in this fashion. So a lot of the things that we're seeing are effects of the customer-facing software, the systems for websites, etc., which, although, of course, it's very inconvenient if they don't work, it means that the bank transactions and the health data are still being protected.
So given that this global IT chaos was triggered by this software update rather than a cyber attack, what are some of the key vulnerabilities in our current IT infrastructure that these incidents reveal?
Well, I think one of the things that we've certainly realized today is that having a very large number of computers all using the same software and all using the same updates at the same time is a very vulnerable position to be in. I don't think anybody really expected anything to happen like this before. Well, it's never happened before, so that's why we haven't expected it. And I'm sure that going forward, what we'll be doing is taking a much more mixed approach so that the updates will be maybe even slightly different at different times, and no doubt tested far more thoroughly. So one of the things that CrowdStrike has got to do is demonstrate to its customers that it's going to do that.
And this is East Asia tonight. We've got to talk about, Japan, Hong Kong, and South Korea. They're, the countries that are impacted in East Asia. Based on their track record, right, which of these countries do you think is most well-equipped to handle such large-scale IT failures?
Well, I think we've already seen that, in fact, although clearly it's affected people in terms of convenience and being able to deal with things, certainly Korea, Japan, Hong Kong have got very robust cybersecurity measures, and of course, any country which has a large number of natural disasters will also have a lot of thought about emergency responses, disaster response, mitigation, that sort of thing, and this really affects the same sort of effect. I mean, in many ways, it would be very similar to the effect of if your computer suddenly lost its power supply or something like that. So people are used to dealing with that sort of problem. So very, very annoying for people involved, but nothing's super critical happening.
Yeah, well, that's obviously good to know. But it just, again, brings us back to the scale of this massive outage. I'm wondering, Professor, should we then be concerned about the potential risks of software vulnerabilities being exploited intentionally in the future?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, of course, this is why this CrowdStrike software is to protect against malicious attack by criminals and bad actors. So what we're stuck in a bit of bind here because, of course, we need to keep updating the defenses against these attacks. But in this case, the defense actually caused the problem that we're seeing now. I think one of the things to be very mindful of is that people shouldn't be starting to turn off their automatic updates for protection against cyber attacks, because there will definitely be people, actors out there going, okay, well, here's a chance. There may be some people just turn this off and don't have any protection for a while. So we've got to be careful about that sort of thing.
Well, thanks so very much for that takeaway, Professor. People shouldn't turn off their automatic updates because of this incident. We hear you loud and clear. Thank you so very much, Professor Perry from the School of IT, Murdoch University. And, well, that does it for East Asia tonight, this Friday. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia, and have yourself a great weekend.